Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Today we're talking about opioid litigation. My guest is Attorney Glenn Ellis. He's a partner here at Freiwald Law. Glenn and I have known each other and worked together for about 15 years. And among the many different kinds of cases that Glenn handles are cases on behalf of families in particular who've lost a loved one or an individual who's been severely injured because of opioid addiction. These are cases against physicians and hospitals who are the prescribers and often the overprescribers of narcotics, pharmacies who may not be aware of the overprescribing or the interaction between opioids and other medications, and the manufacturers who are responsible for a variety of bad conduct, including false advertising, fraud, and failure to warn of the dangers of opioid addiction. These are really important cases. This remains a public health crisis, one that has been pushed back to the inside pages of the paper with COVID, of course, but not for the people, not for the families that are living with the terrible impact of opioid addiction, and in many cases, too many cases, death of a family member. So stay tuned for a really important conversation about what you need to know about these cases and what you can do if you know somebody who has suffered from opioid addiction. My usual PSAs now: everybody please stay safe, wear your mask. We are still in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic too. We can't let our guard down. We have to continue to be vigilant and be safe. And also, I know in many states we're fast approaching the time when mail-in ballots are being sent out. Please be sure you know how you're going to vote on November 3rd and make arrangements now so that it's not done last minute. This is an extremely important election and we have to make sure everybody is registered to vote and that everybody then does vote. So, thank you. Stay tuned for this important episode. I know you'll enjoy it. Please feel free to send us comments, and note that we are also on YouTube, so you can find us there as well as wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much. I want to welcome my guest today on the program, Glenn Ellis. He's an attorney here at Freiwald Law, his partner here. We've worked together a long time, Glenn, maybe 15, 16 years or more at this point?
Almost 15. I think this will be 15 this year.
Okay. Feels more like 16.
Well, yeah.
But anyway, welcome
Especially
to...
This last summer feels like an extra 5 years.
That's true. Welcome to Good Law, Bad Law. Thanks for agreeing to be on the program.
Thanks for having me.
And to talking about cases involving opioid addiction. I know that you're handling a number of these cases, and I thought this would be a good topic. It's still tremendous concern all across the country, though news about opioid addiction generally and opioid litigation has been dwarfed by so many other stories this year, but still a very important subject to many, many tens of thousands of families. And I thought it would be really good to hear from you and talk about how you're using the courts in individual cases, meaning on behalf of an individual or an individual's family, to pursue justice in some of these terrible, tragic stories. So maybe you could give us a little background on yourself first of all, just a little bit of a bio so people know a bit about you, and then we can get into some of the cases that you're working on.
Well, I guess I've been an attorney now for about 20 years, and I started out my academic life in the sciences, small molecule biochemistry, because I thought I wanted to do patent law, and I worked at both Rohm and Haus and AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca being in the news recently for their vaccine work.
Right.
And I worked in their IP departments, and then I realized that that really wasn't the fit that I thought it was going to be, even though it was a fit sort of academically. And I decided I wanted to do litigation and started on the defense side for a very short period of time, and then I came over here this year, it would be 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've done a lot of environmental work together, and now we're doing opioid litigation, and it's the same kind of science that takes me back to my days when I was at AstraZeneca.
Right. And you also had a background as a teacher for a while.
Yeah, I taught chemistry for a year when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, if I wanted to go to law school or medical school. My wife at the time went to medical school, and I went to law school.
And explain to folks what it means to be a trial lawyer, because I know there's a distinction, and I think it matters a lot in how you approach litigation. You mentioned litigation, which people may have heard of, but how is being a trial lawyer different? How does that generally fit into the way you approach cases?
Well, I mean, on a basic level, it's problem solving. You have a client who's been hurt in some way, and you're trying to get them to a better place. The system that we have is a monetary restitution or monetary justice system. So you're trying to get them enough funds from the defendant, the person that hurt them, to bring them back to the closest you can get to their life before they were hurt. And because really, that's the only way you're going to achieve any kind of justice for them in this field, especially in the medical malpractice field. In the opioid field, we are seeing a dissolving of companies. Part of the Purdue settlement was that Purdue would be dissolved and all of its assets would be transferred to a new company. So that's new.
Purdue being one of the major manufacturers.
Right, being one of the major manufacturers. So that's new. But aside from that sort of new development, we're trying to find justice for our clients and make them whole. And that's what we do. And the only way to do that is to work up the case, get the facts, and the expert support, and force defendants to pay.
And to take on a case like this, and I find it fascinating, the intersection between science and law here. And you're right, we've worked on a lot of cases where that was the case. This isn't just, were you wearing your eyeglasses that day and how did you see clearly enough to identify a witness? There's very complicated science very often in these cases, and no different in opioid cases. How does that, and I want to get into some of the issues too, but just to segue from what you started talking about your science background, how does science play a part in these cases?
Well, with opioids, it's a chemical you ingest, so as soon as you ingest it, it's a chemical reaction in the person. So whether, and opioids have sort of spread sort of nefariously through society, it really touches, when you're talking about opioid litigation, you're talking about a vast swath of litigation, all the way from commercial trucking accidents to the kind of big pharma litigation that we just mentioned. So when you're looking at, say, for example, a commercial trucking accident, that we have a case like that, there you're talking about, okay, he was on opioids, he was on Oxycontin, but he was also on a benzo. So what is the synergetic effects between Oxycontin and benzo? And for what he's doing, he's driving a vehicle over 10,000 pounds. What are the federal regulations with regard to that? And you're talking about, the slowing down of reflex times and how the body deals with those two drugs in their system. And then if you're looking at, the big manufacturing cases, there you're talking about addiction leading to oftentimes illicit drug use, which then leads to overdose. And that sort of area of litigation is becoming even bigger because now you have companies that were kind of rushing in the last couple of years to market products as a cure for opioid addiction. But it turns out that those drugs in and of themselves have all kinds of other complications and effects on people that are opioid dependent. So it's all about the science in this, but in terms of how you look at it, you have to think about what your case is, what your cause of action is, and what the damages were at the end of the day.
Yeah, and let's pick up on that because there are thousands of opioid cases going on right now in courts across the country. There are cases that have been brought by insurance companies, cases that have been brought by states and municipalities who bear the cost of opioid addiction. There have been some criminal prosecutions, there have been some federal enforcement actions. Your focus has been on representing individuals or families. How, maybe you could describe a case, and it may be difficult to talk about specifics because these are pending cases and we can't get into confidential information about those specific cases, but maybe you could describe what that means in a case on behalf of an individual or family and how that's different from some of the other kinds of cases that people have probably heard about.
Right. Well, nationwide, 41 people die every day from prescription opioid overdoses. In the Commonwealth, I think the number is like 20 or something like that. We're the fourth highest.
Here in Pennsylvania.
Here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And then here in the Delaware Valley, we're just ahead of Delaware. So if you count Pennsylvania and Delaware together, we're probably second overall. So it's really impactful to the families, especially in this part of the state, but really overall in the entire state. And so when you're handling a personal case, a personal injury case, type of case for opioids, you're really looking at looking through the wreckage of that person's life. We represent a young man who was a veteran, had a really great job here in the city, college graduate, and he got an opioid addiction from shoulder injury that he suffered when he was playing college rugby. It followed him through life and ultimately ended up in an overdose. He was never able to shake it. There's some other issues in there with the doctors and what they prescribed, but it took his life. So now we have to deal with his father and his mother and sort of helping them make sense of what happened to him and try to create some justice for him in the aftermath of that. So it's different than an insurance or, the counties. You look at these mass national litigations in Oklahoma where the state AG sued, or if you look at the ones in Ohio where it's like 2,000 some cases, but it's mostly counties, and they're trying to get money back because they're buying, drugs and medical equipment for their police officers. They got to hire more police officers. They have to pay the charges at the hospital for the charity cases. So they're trying to get that money back because they want to service the community. What we're doing is we're trying to put someone's life back together if they haven't died, or we're trying to bring some semblance of justice to a family who's lost a loved one.
So, and you mentioned that, when somebody is hurt, obviously, if somebody becomes addicted to opioids, that's a hurt in and of itself. And then if somebody goes on to suffer some harm, even death, because of that addiction, that's an even greater magnitude of injury. Who are the parties, who are the individuals or entities that you look at in evaluating an individual case? Somebody who has been hurt in that way. Who are you looking at as the responsible parties for those hurts?
Well, if you get a case now, it's a little bit different now than it would be years ago. I mean, basically, opioid sort of litigation at a federal level has been going on for 10 years. Over 10 years ago, Purdue executives were fined for illegally pushing off-label use of oxycodone. And then those prosecutions went way down, and they actually changed the law in 2016 to make it harder on the DEA in terms of their enforcement actions. So when you're looking at that kind of issue, you want to be, careful that you examine the entire stream of this person's life, and you want to look at all of the doctors, and you want to look at what they're prescribing, what's called the dosage, the morphine equivalent dosage, and you want to look at the pharmacies, and then you want to look at the manufacturers. And
we'll go through each of those, because those are all different. Those would be different legal claims in each of those instances.
And so in 2017, the states got together and they made it a lot easier for reporting. So before, if you were in Philadelphia, for pharmacy reporting. If you were in Philadelphia, you could get an oxycodone prescription at one of the pill mills down in South Philly, and then you could go get one in South Jersey, and nobody would know, the Philadelphia doctors wouldn't know, the Philadelphia CVS wouldn't know what the New Jersey CVS is doing. In 2017, they created a database, the doctors created a database, so now with someone's name and date of birth, you can actually pool their entire pharmacy records. So when we get a client on it with an opioid case, that's the first place we're going to look. We're going to pool their record to see who's the prescriber, because that has that information on there. It has the pharmacy name, and it has the dosage and the morphine equivalents, and it also has when the script was written and when the script was filled, which is important because you're looking for sometimes overlap.
Right.
And so that's the first thing you're going to do.
And you're looking for whether the doctors were looking for that overlap too, which they should.
Now that is a part of the standard of care.
Mm-hmm.
Where as I was saying before, in the past, that wasn't part of the standard of care because that database wasn't available. So now if you're prescribing opioids, you have to pool that on your patient, and you have to pool it multiple times to make sure that that patient is not doctor shopping, is not trying to get multiple prescriptions, is not holding prescriptions, and quite frankly, you want to make sure that that patient is also not taking excess prescriptions or selling their prescription.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too.
So there's also now becoming part of the standard of care is drug testing your patient to make sure that that patient actually has the right level of the metabolite. If you're talking about oxycodone, there's a specific metabolite. You want to make sure that they have that right level in there, because if they've got nothing in there, they might be selling their prescription. Or if you're testing once a month, they might have used it all up in the first couple weeks. And then they may have been struggling in the last 2 weeks, or they may have been medicating with alcohol or street drugs. So that's also part of the standard of care. So when you're looking at a patient, you're going to start there, and then you're going to pull the doctor's medical records, and then you're going to look at the doctor, because opioids were so pervasive everywhere, and so many different types of doctors were prescribing them. The standard is a little bit different for different specialty. Rheumatologists were prescribing a lot of oxycodone, but the rheumatology boards came out and said that's not appropriate. If you have breakthrough pain or pain that can't be dealt with, you got to push them on to a pain specialist. We have a case like that where a rheumatologist for years, where the patient is coming in 9 out of 10 pain for years. That doctor keeps writing, keeps increasing her dose, and never sends her out to a specialist. Ultimately, what happens with that guy, he ends up in jail because he's essentially running a pill mill in that case.
The rheumatologist.
Yeah, the rheumatologist is now, he's actually, hasn't been sentenced yet because of the pandemic. He was supposed to be sentenced, he pled guilty to overprescribing of oxycodone. But even if you don't end up in sort of a criminal situation like he did, you would look at that record and you would say, why is this guy, the patient, he's written that he keeps prescribing it, you have the record from the pharmacy that you pulled initially, she's been going and filling the prescriptions, you can see in the blood test that she's been taking it. Why has he been prescribing that? Why hasn't he referred her? Why hasn't he tried something different? A nerve blocker in that case, or something else? And then you take it to an expert in that field, and then it's the standard is different, because the standard for a cancer doctor is going to be different for cancer-related pain than for our rheumatology friend, or for an internal medicine doctor, or for an ortho doctor who's prescribing it post-surgery. So that's kind of the process, how we work our way through the case. And then once you get to the other side of that, then you have to start looking at the pharmacy.
Okay, but before we get to the pharmacy, because you also mentioned concern about interaction between different types of medications, and one problem which you discussed is doctors may not know what someone else is already prescribing. That's important to coordinate, be responsible for. Or somebody's going to a number of different kinds of physicians and they're not communicating about what they're prescribing, which can lead to overprescribing of a narcotic.
Right.
But also there's this issue of interaction between drugs, and that's another big problem, right? Because opioids can interact adversely, and that it's just surprising that it's taken this long for attention to really be focused on these issues, considering how long opioids have been around, how long they've been prescribed to the huge extent that they have been, where I think, physicians are accustomed and have been for a long time to worry about drug interactions, to worry about dose and testing. I mean, I think it was one of my very first trials 25 years ago involved a drug and whether the physician had monitored levels of this drug in the system. It wasn't an opioid, it was a different drug. It was actually an anti-seizure medication. So the idea that physicians need to be on top of those things is part of what they do in giving good patient care. That idea generally has been around a long time, but it seems like it's only in recent years that it's being applied in these opioid cases.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of interactions between something like, say, morphine and a lot of other drugs, like drugs that are prescribed for depression and things like that, has been known for a long time. There are black box warnings,
right,
in PDR. But they only came up with this database in 2017. I agree, it's something that should have existed a long time ago. Now, this database will give you all narcotics that can be prescribed, and also give you some weird things like testosterone will show up on there as well. There was a group that got together that decided what would come up on this database. Not everything that's prescribed will show up. So when you know what the narcotics are, then yeah, your expert is gonna have to look at the other things that the person's been prescribed, and quite frankly, the other things that the person is taking over the counter, and what their particular issues are. Is it somebody with diabetes? Is it somebody with cirrhosis? What their pre-existing conditions are, and all of those things can affect or could have resulted in whatever harm that is. And the harm can span, from, just a simple falling, resulting in broken bones, things like that, all the way to death.
Now, let's talk about pharmacies. And again, I can see how this database is so valuable in being able to track in real time for the physicians and others involved in managing somebody who's on an opioid, and also in reconstructing what happened if you're looking at a potential case. But again, this whole issue of having databases, I mean, we have big chain pharmacies, CVS, Rite Aid, and Walgreens, and so on. I remember a case, again, from years ago where it was against a retail pharmacy for not checking their own database on drug interactions. They were filling a prescription for a certain drug. It was in their system that the patient was already on some other drug. There was a known bad interaction between these two medications, and the pharmacy didn't catch that. Is that becoming a more important theory, so to speak, or potential case against pharmacies in these opioid cases?
Yeah, I mean, now that this database exists, that theory, you'd be able, if that was the issue, if it was the combination of two drugs that should have raised the red flag, there's no way of avoiding that now.
Yeah.
That's just so clear, and it should be crystal clear to the pharmacist. Only through, negligence would that happen. And then the other issue, which I think that, you look at the litigation that's going on right now in the Northern District of Ohio, the pharmacies are in there. They're the ones actually that are kind of fighting. In fact, in August of this year, the court just denied the pharmacies one of their motions to dismiss the second amendment, I forget if it was the second or third amended complaint, because they didn't want to know. They were making so much money from these prescriptions for opioids, and then we're not even talking about, contraindications. We're just talking about one guy getting 90 pills of something in one place, and then crossing the bridge again, 90 pills on the other side, and then just deciding how much he was going to take to get high. But they got to charge for that, so they didn't want to talk to each other. I mean, the fact that in Philadelphia before 2017, you could fill a narcotic in Philadelphia, walk over the bridge to Camden to a CVS and fill that narcotic, again for that person is kind of crazy, because everyone has known that these pharmaceutical companies are oftentimes bad actors. I mean, I don't know when the first mega Department of Justice fine for off-label prescribing was hit. I know AstraZeneca got hit with like $225 million like maybe 12 years ago. So everybody's known that the pharmaceutical industry is about making money, but there was no watchdogs.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you look at DEA enforcement, in 2014, enforcement civil actions, went from something like 40 to like 6. And mostly
40 million to 6
million? No, like 40 actions, 40 civil filings to like 6 or something like that. And one of the reasons why that's kind of complained about is that they were actually poaching the more experienced investigators from the DEA. So the DEA couldn't keep up with it. So all their enforcement actions went down. But we've always known that pharmaceutical businesses are interested in the bottom line. Why there was no watchdog, why it took till 2017 is kind of, it's kind of obvious, but it's like, no one's come out and said, hey, we were still making money, so we didn't want that.
Well, and again, that's where civil cases like the kinds you're handling and that many others are handling come in.
Right.
I mean, we think of ourselves as trial lawyers, but often we also think of ourselves as civil prosecutors in ways that the government doesn't do because of policy or doesn't have the resources to do because of budgeting or whatever it might be. These cases often have a great likeness to civil prosecution. So how, even though you say that we've known for a long time about the highly addictive nature of opioids in particular and the literally billions of dollars that the drug industry has made on addiction on these drugs, when you're looking at a case on behalf of an individual or a family who's lost a family member to opioid addiction, what are some of the things you're looking at in terms of manufacturer liability?
Yeah. So if we get past the pharmacy and we see, well, it's a recent case and it doesn't look like there's been any of that kind of missed opportunity to stop the person, and it's just been the doctor continuing to overprescribe, then we look at the manufacturer. What is their marketing? What are the drugs that they were pushing? Because it's different for all the different, like a fentanyl patch had different marketing strategy than oxycodone did. And we have to look and see, what's the opioid, what's the marketing, what's the other litigation out there? And is the manufacturer in bankruptcy? Because a lot of these companies have rushed for bankruptcy protection. And in fact, with Purdue, part of the settlement that they reached was that they would, as a step one, go into bankruptcy. And then they would dissolve, the assets would be pushed off into a new company, and then I think there would be a $3 billion fund, and then actually had this weird thing where the new company would own oxycodone, and then any new money made from oxycodone would be used to fund settlements and addiction prevention centers. It's something that the Pennsylvania Attorney General is very against. There's been lots of objections to that settlement.
Because why is that?
Well, I think his quote was something like he finds it, distasteful, the notion of oxycodone continuing to be made and sold, and then the profits somehow come back to the people that are becoming addicted to it.
Yeah. We'll addict you, and then we'll take care of you when you're addicted.
Right. I think a lot of people would just like to see that kind of synthetic opioid disappear.
Yeah.
It's part of what's fueling medicinal marijuana. There's a lot more doctors that are on board for medicinal marijuana.
Because it's not addictive.
Because it's not addictive.
Yeah.
It's not nearly as addictive as synthetic opioids. And it's not nearly as destructive either to the individual, to the person. Because opioids are also, physically taxing on the human body. If you take opioids, there's all kinds of orthopedic issues that can arise because it's just, you're just literally destroying yourself with this synthetic opioid. Some people say anything synthetic is bad to put in your body, Here it's something really powerful that's bad. So if the drug that you were taking that caused your damage is from a manufacturer that's in bankruptcy, you have to put in a bankruptcy claim and you have to get in line with everybody else. The Purdue OxyContin one just closed. It was extended, but it just closed recently. It may get opened again if the lead attorneys there involved that decide that it should be. We've submitted those kinds of claims on behalf of our clients who have taken that drug. For the other ones, you look at the marketing, and usually these guys were really blatant about saying that it's not addictive, that pushing it for more than just sort of refractory cancer pain, pushing it for all kinds of pain.
Right. For end of life.
Type
hospice care.
So so you have the marketing, you have the off-label pushing, and then usually there's also pretty well documented sort of kickback and illicit schemes that have come to light from basically all of these companies engaged in some form of that. It seems like that we're in this space where that's the way that they fueled the growth of it. Either they were paying the doctors off, or in some cases they're keeping the compensation for the pharmaceutical reps really low and then paying them all in bonus so that they push those doctors more and more. They all engage in something like that.
So these are basically fraud claims.
They would be basically fraud, failure to warn claims, label claims, those kinds of
false
advertising, implied and express warranty type claims. Because these things all come with a label when you go get it. You go get it at the pharmacy, it's got a label. There's advertising everywhere. I mean, I don't know, you can find a client that hasn't seen some form of pharmaceutical advertising, and if they're sitting in a pain specialist doctor, they've probably seen something from Purdue, back in the day, or Johnson & Johnson, or Jensen, or one of these other players.
Yeah, we mentioned regulatory fines against the big pharma companies, and it always struck me that when you see news about these settlements, that we're going to pay $200 million, we're going to pay $1 billion in our fine, we're going to pay $300 billion, whatever it is. It sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, but then they go on about their business. They're not going out of business. They can afford to pay the fine, and then they go on about their business, which tells you the scope of the profits they're making. That these fines don't seem to have deterred the behavior. It's just, maybe it's on a grand scale, but it still is it's just a cost of doing business. But now, with all the civil litigation, which isn't just about, even if it's $300 million, what effectively is a slap on the wrist for these companies, it would seem like the cumulative effect of all the cases that are happening in courts, including the kinds of cases you're bringing, ought to bring about some real change. Sometimes when you bring a case, you are looking for compensation, but you're also, as part of what's driving the family, and what you as the lawyer can help drive for them, is a certain kind of justice beyond just the dollars and cents, which obviously are extremely important. But are there ways in which you see that, either on an individual level or based on the cumulative effect of all the litigation that's going on in this area, that we could start to see some real change? And what do you think that looks like?
Well, I think overall, having been in the pharmaceutical space before I did litigation, I think it's always been considered a cost of doing business, pushing off-label use.
Yeah.
And I think, quite frankly, I think most pharmaceutical companies think about ways of pushing that, whether that's, through creating thought leaders or, paying for things sort of back end, publications. And so I think that's been going on for a long time. And here, it's funny we're talking about this because in this space, in the opioid space, much like what's being complained about with COVID, there's just been a complete abdication by the federal government. The federal government is not driving these litigations. I mean, if you go back to 2017 to the Oklahoma litigation, which was kind of the first big lawsuit where everybody was kind of like, oh wow, they're going to sue everybody, pharmacies and the manufacturers. That was the state AG. That was the state AG. And if you look at the litigations going on in Northern Ohio, those are county level executives that are taking it upon themselves to sue.
Right.
The federal government has really dropped the ball. I mean, the federal government has really failed to tackle this problem. I mean, and I think there's a real hunger in the community and the nation for the federal government to do something. You know, it's one thing that Donald Trump ran on, tackling the opioid crisis, and it's really something that the Obama administration really failed on. For example, before 2016, the DEA, if they noticed a really large distribution of opioids going to a particular place, they could stop that distribution. They could stop it from getting there. Yeah. I mean, keep in mind, in 2018, 11% of all U.S. counties had enough opioids to provide one prescription for every member of that community. So, you know, these huge bulk shipments were not that hard to spot.
And there was that case in West Virginia where
right.
they were able to identify huge shipments to small communities in West Virginia and raise all kinds of red flags.
So in 2016, that law changed to make it harder for the DEA to do that, which is just crazy.
That is crazy.
Because in 2016, we knew more about the opioid crisis, not less. So the federal government is out of the space. And it's really being led by counties. And in 2019, our own AG filed a big lawsuit where part of that consolidated action in Delaware County, we have cases in that action as well, which he was joined by lots of other counties. He's got the state, and there's other counties, there's other municipalities, and you know, even the tribal nations are part of these large mass litigations.
Right.
And they're pushing to try to not only try to get as much back to create funds for recovery and try to pay back some of that taxpayer debt that was incurred, but I think they are really pushing to end this industry in a way that the federal government has really never pushed any pharmaceutical company to end. I mean, we saw Purdue. I mean, Purdue made $35 billion in like a 10-year span. They're effectively a finished company. That's never happened. Johnson & Johnson that grew most of the poppies for the opioids, that was made by everybody else. They just got hit with a $500 million verdict, which then got reduced a little bit because there was some miscalculation by the judge. But that's a huge number on one case, and that one case involved only a few counties. Yeah. So they've got to continue to litigate against it. I don't see that the opioid industry as it exists currently will be able to exist, and I think that is a good thing. Mm-hmm. And I think all of these families that have had the courage to step up and bring suit, and all of these AGs that have realized they're on their own and they've got to do something for their state, and all these county executives that have decided that, you know, they cannot sit silently by just because industry is doing something. I think they should all be applauded for that, because I think at the end of the day, that's the only reason why Purdue, for example, is basically finished and not flooding the market with more of these really dangerous drugs.
Well, Glenn, maybe we could wrap up by sort of speak to listeners about what people need to know or should know about whether they might have a case. What does that look like? What should people think about? What kinds of questions should they be asking? What should they do?
Well, I think that if you're someone who was prescribed opioids and you feel like it was either an overprescription or the prescription has lasted longer than it should have, or you just are uncertain about where you fit into these, you know, bigger litigations that are going on out there, you should contact us. You may have just a claim that can go into one of the bankruptcy proceedings, because just simply taking the drug and becoming addicted to the drug, even if nothing else happened to you, entitles you to recovery. So you could just have been addicted to it, you could have still kept your job, you could have never got hurt, and you would still be entitled to a claim, because the law has recognized that addiction is an additional burden that's been placed on these individuals, basically for the greed of these companies.
So addiction is an injury in and of itself.
Addiction just by itself is an
Gotcha.
injury, is
Okay.
sufficient for you to recover something. Obviously, if your damages are more extensive than that, that something will be different. So if you've been prescribed these narcotics, these opioids, by either a hospital or a physician, then you should contact us. You should reach out to us, and we can kind of go in a little bit more detail than we have here about sort of the landscape and where you fit into the landscape, and we can help you in different ways to make sure that you're able to recover for what happened to you in your particular case.
Incredible. Glenn, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. This is, it's not right that it has been pushed to the back burner because of so many other things, but because there's so many lives affected tragically. And so I want to thank you for what you're doing, and thanks for sharing your insights today.
No, thank you for having me. This was good.